Good morning, everyone. We'll just give a few moments for everybody to jump on board. We can see all the attendees coming onto the webinar now. So thanks everyone for joining. So I guess today's presentation is hosted obviously by Pateras. So thank you very much all for accepting this invitation. And today's topic is Property Development 101, and it's a question and answer session. You're all welcome throughout today's session to ask all the questions you would like around property development. We've been able to assemble three really great presenters for today's presentation. What we thought in putting today's presentation together was we wanted to get experts in different areas and aspects of property development. We see in our client base at Wilson Pateras when dealing with clients is that many people who do enjoy a success, whether it's in their work or whether it's in their business, they may often end up going down the path of some sort of property development. And that's often after they've bought some property and have got to know the industry. And the three presenters we've got together today, we feel are really, really important from the perspective of how you would find a property. And we've got Golan Flamm from Hodges Real Estate to talk more about how you would help find a property and the types of properties that are out there in the marketplace when it comes to development. In respect of looking at your planning permits and pre-build processes and so forth, we've got Ikonomidis from Ikonomidis Design. And then finally, how you would fund your property development, finding the money and importantly that bank funding to do your development. We've got Brett Elliot, who's recently joined Wilson Pateras Lending and Finance as our Lending and Finance Principal. So without further delay, we'll get Golan on board. So as you do have this presentation, feel more than free to put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat dialogue box on your screen. And we expect today's session will go for around 40 minutes. So welcome aboard, Golan.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited and love being part of these things. I think it's invaluable. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So property sales, generally, obviously, it's a very, I guess, buoyant time when it comes to property sales, but specifically property development. So property development sites. So in the areas you operate in, maybe firstly, just the areas that you operate in, the types of suburbs and areas that you work in. How would you describe that?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So my office is in Caulfield, but we service Caulfield South, Caulfield North, Carnegie, Glen Huntly, Murrumbeena, Bentley East. As far as, Moorabbin, and, we go to Windsor, Elwood, Brighton. So the Southeast, we spread ourselves quite wide these days in real estate because of the internet. We have, you have agents that sell not just in 2 or 3 suburbs, but probably within half an hour of where our office is where we're willing to go. So, and we're not the only ones that operate that way.
Yeah, excellent. So when it comes to specifically property development sites, we know that in Melbourne, there's some land that's really just for single dwellings. There's some land that's for multiple dwellings or even larger. What are you sort of seeing at the moment when it comes to those like dual occupancy sites or 3-unit sites? What are the types of things that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, there's an insatiable appetite for sites that are conducive for dual locks, so 2 townhouses. So normally developers and potential purchasers are looking for at least 600 square meters. A good block I find that buyers are looking for is probably at least 640 to 700 square meters, because you can get some really good sized townhouses on there, 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a single garage. If they can find a block that's got a wide enough frontage and the council will allow it, if they can get a double garage, that's also extremely beneficial and very, very high in demand. Very, very hard at the moment. There's not a lot of blocks for sale, even off market, let alone on market. And there's a lot of developers looking, but there's also a lot of mum and dads who are looking to develop, and also to do a development with their in-laws or their friends, and they will move into one, and their business partners in that venture would move into the other one.
And so, in terms of the, I guess we've got, you mentioned, people looking for that 600 square meter type site. Are there specific types of like if I'm someone who's buying in, I'm a first time developer. Often the sales agents that I've worked with in the past, they'll often think of the end product in mind too when they're sort of looking at sites. In the areas you operate in, that sort of southeast of Melbourne, what is the end product which is desirable? Let's say with townhouses, something that's going to end up with 2 or 3 on a site. You mentioned double garages, that sort of thing. What are the types of things that people want in an end product?
In end product, so typically people want 2 townhouses rather than 3. 3 townhouses are usually smaller, and it's more for the young couples who are starting off. But the demand is really for the bigger townhouses, which are just 2 on the block. So there's no body corporate, where if there's 3, there's going to be an owner's corp. So 2 on the block, completely subdivided, 4 bedrooms, good sized bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, 2 good living areas. And if they can have a double garage, great. But it's now acceptable to have a single garage where they can park a second car in the driveway. But it's all about space. Now we've seen in the last 18 months, a study or a home office is extremely important because most people now are working from home, even though people are starting to go back to the office, as the culture and the sentiment's changed in terms of what's acceptable. So a lot more people are working part of the week at home and they need a home office or a study. So 4 bedrooms, and you might even find upon the entry where there's a nook upon the entry, they've built a home office or a little study. That's extremely desirable. And also what's really come back, with a vengeance is pools. People are after pools because, we've seen that the government can stop us from going to indoor pools, right? So it's hard to find the right block size in order to fit all that. But if they can, we're seeing little lap pools being put on the side towards the back, as well as a little bit of a backyard. So those are the things they're looking for. 2 main living areas so the kids can go and obviously watch movies or play PlayStation while the parents are hosting their friends, and big proportions in terms of bedrooms as well. That's what they're looking for. So it's for that growing family, basically.
Yeah. So it's interesting in terms of that appetite where somebody maybe 2 years ago was looking for something that's a little different to what they're looking for now. So would it be fair to say that as somebody who's a first-time property developer coming in, often we're trained, and I've heard this before years ago, where like it was sort of the more you can get on there, the better. Like that was like a bit of the way of thinking, right? I have to get 4 on a block instead of 2. But what you seem to be suggesting is that the trends around consumers, the end user of the product, the end homeowner, is much different now. They're looking for a bit more space, a bit more lifestyle, conscious of what could happen in the future.
Yeah, I think it depends on which suburb, but if you're looking at the blue chip southeastern suburbs, if you're putting 3 small ones, this is from my experience and my opinion and what I tell a lot of my clients who are developers, if you're looking at putting a townhouse on a block, I think it's better to put 2 big ones rather than 3 small ones, because 3 small ones, you've got to look at who is your buyer at the end game, and your buyer for 3 small ones is going to be young couples who don't have as much of a budget, right? And it's a stepping stone for them. Where if you build 2 big ones, it could be either for a growing family or it could be for a downsizer if the townhouse has a lift or a downstairs second master bedroom.
Yeah.
So, and those are the 2 demographics that have the most amount of money: the downsizer, the empty nester, and also the growing family, where they're set in their career, they're established, and they're earning good money, and they're coming from a stepping stone from a smaller property where they've got probably some equity and they've got some savings in their bank, and they're taking that leap. So the 3 small ones, smaller townhouses normally don't sell as well. But it also depends on the area. If you go further east or further south, if you go far enough, the smaller townhouses are probably better because the affordability of the big ones, it won't sell for as much money. There's probably more younger people looking to buy at a cheaper level. So, but around where I work, I always advise my clients do 2 bigger ones rather than 3 smaller ones.
And so if we're a first-time developer, we're looking to buy into the market, what are the sort of things that often come up with a negotiation with a vendor who's selling a development site? Is there often specific things that may go into that negotiation or arrangement that might be different from just a normal residential house? So what have you seen in the past? Have you seen things that are a little bit different or helpful to the purchaser?
Yeah, sure. So there's a few different elements. The land might be sold with plans and permits. It may not, but as a potential purchaser, what might help the vendor to get across the line is there's a few different things that you can both offer to help both sides of the equation. So a developer usually wants a longer settlement. And in order for that to happen, you might offer a premium to the potential seller, right? So I've done a deal where the settlement was 12 months, but they offered $100,000 extra for a 12-month settlement because they had other developments happening, and the time was more valuable to them. And to the vendor, with the interest in the bank, how much do you have to have in the bank to earn $100,000 in interest, or how much time, right? So $100,000 just to wait another 12 months for them suited their situation. So something like that, offering a premium if you wanted a longer settlement, and things that are also in the negotiation is the ability to apply for plans and permits before you settle, right? But someone else will talk to that for, more than me. But there's a whole bunch of other things that you can negotiate. Rent back clauses if it's a long settlement. It's depending on the situation of the purchaser and the situation of the seller in terms of what you could offer to sweeten the deal. But there's, there's many different things that can go into that negotiation. Access to the property. So, a surveyor can go walking around the block. This is all preparation to get plans and permits in place.
Yeah. And they're important because the reason why we've got the three presenters is because all these issues tie into each other. So, for instance, the 12-month settlement, that can be really important because sometimes a purchaser has to get time. They need time to get their affairs in order to even settle the block, and that's where Brett would come in and work out the bank finance. So those extra little tricks can be quite helpful to somebody who's even buying in for the first time. It just gives them more wiggle room to work these sort of issues out. You would have seen perhaps vendors, and particularly at the moment, like if we talk about the current state of the market, there's a lot more buyers than sellers, I imagine. So that would maybe change the landscape of negotiations a little bit.
Yeah, at the moment, demand is far outweighing supply, especially when it comes to blocks. We're seeing that stock levels have increased in the last 3-4 weeks. I think last weekend, the auction numbers were over 1,100. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, they were hovering around 8 to 950. That's a big difference. And clearance rates, I think, were a couple of weeks ago over 90%. And last weekend, I think it was just a smidge over 80%. But if you have a look at what's being sold, there isn't a lot of actual pure blocks where it's just really land value. So there's a lot of deals being done on market and off market. But, if I had right now 10 blocks that were not even reasonably priced, but a little bit priced on the high side, and they were good blocks where, they were conducive for dual lock. There were no trees in the way. There were no weird easements or covenants or, things like that. I could probably get them sold within, a day of making phone calls. That's how much demand there is at the moment for good blocks.
Yeah, this is the interesting thing because what I've experienced sometimes working with people who may have not had as much experience, even just in property in general. They may enter the market now as someone looking and saying, oh, there's a quoted price and I want to try and get a discount on that quoted price. And they're also then saying, coupled with that, saying, oh, I'll do it next week, which that might not be where the market's currently at. If you're wanting to genuinely get in, there's a sense of urgency because your competition is probably working in the same level of urgency as well, or heightened urgency. So in terms of then just getting advice, if I'm a new person to development, the agent often is working for the vendor. They're paid by the vendor. Can an agent work for a buyer? Like someone in your position, if someone was to approach Golan and say, look, I want to buy a 600 square metre dual lock site in Caulfield and I want your help, how would that work from your perspective?
Listen, I think there is a way where, so first of all, we do have a duty of care to the vendor first and foremost, but you can help a developer by, what I say to a developer is, listen, I can provide you with an opportunity, and the opportunity is to know about the block. You will have to pay the market value, but I'm going to give you an opportunity that potentially no one else knows about, but you have to pay that price. And what I ask in return is you give me the resales, right? So, but first and foremost, you've got to get the highest possible price for your vendor. That goes without saying, right? But you can help a developer by giving them an opportunity that maybe 5 other developers don't know about. Yeah. So that's what I do. If it's off market, on market, it'll be advertised, right? Yeah. And you can sort of give a leg up to a developer by communicating to them in a certain way, by giving them some information that is still in the best interest of the vendor, but helps them have clarity as to where they need to be price-wise, right? You can, with skill and with experience, you can balance these things in order to adhere to your duty of care to the vendor and develop relationships with a developer and get them blocks and get the resales as well.
It's like repeat business, I guess is what you're saying. If you know somebody's going to really be investing with your business, you're going to be probably more willing to work with them and help them a little more.
Yeah. So I've got developers and also there's different developers who might not be, some act really quickly, some are a little bit slower, some only want to do a certain amount of, developments at one time. Some are always looking for a development. So, I had dinner with a very good friend of mine who's a developer as well. And last night he said to me, he's got about 4 or 5 he's doing at the moment. He said, I'm ready now for the next one, where a week ago he wasn't ready. So that was his way of saying, let me know if an opportunity comes along, right? So even though he's a great friend of mine, he'll still have to pay the price, right? So, and I tell all my clients, friends, or whoever it is, I don't sell bargains, right? Because when you sell a property for them, they want the same attitude, right? So if you sell them something that's below, or even if you try to sell them something below market value, that's not the right, you don't want to be known for that. You want to be known to work your butt up to get the highest possible price for your vendor. And they will respect that, because when you ask them to give them their property to sell, they know that you're going to be doing the same thing.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks, Golan. That's some great insights there. Thanks for your time, and I'm sure we might have some more questions in the next half an hour or so. So over to thanks, Golan. So over to Pat. So Pat from Ikonomidis Design. Thank you, Pat, for joining today. Might have to, you're there on mute, I think, Pat, if you want to unmute your screen.
Yes, normal technical difficulty. Thanks for inviting us. So,
no worries.
Yep, so mine might be a little bit more structured, so feel free to butt in, Nick, and just ask me any questions you need, sort of want me to tease out a little bit, but I'll try and break down the structure a little bit. Obviously, it's a property development 101, so there's no point sort of trying to get too nitty gritty into some detail, but I'll try and give some little bit of sort of tidbits that might assist you along sort of a property development journey. So the first one is obviously there's 3. I'll break it down to 3 very broad phases. There's an acquisition phase. There's then a permit phase and a construction phase. So right from the point where you decide that you want to develop, right through to having an end product. And that product could be for sale or it could be for lease. Now, in the acquisition phase, obviously you're searching for a site and you'll use people to help you with that search. The part I want to focus in on is that due diligence period. So that's a part where we do get involved with for our clients and help them assess a site. So if you want to go to the next slide, Nick. So the due diligence period is hugely important. Never assume what you can do with the site. This is where a lot of people can come unstuck. You can have a street that's all the sites are the same size block. They're all 1,000 square meters. They're all got either 4 townhouses on them, and you wanted to do something similar, 4 townhouses on the site. But there could be reasons why on that particular site you can't do it. You need to have a look at the title. Are there any easements that are going to affect what you can develop? Is there a covenant on the block that restricts the development? Then you zone in and hone in on the planning controls. What's the zoning allow? Is there a density cap? Are there overlays like heritage, flood, and vegetation protection that are going to influence what you can and can't do with the site? What's the neighbourhood character like? Things that will influence costs. For example, is a chimp required? A chimp is a cultural and heritage management plan that involves archaeologists to do assessments and reports. Can be costly, can be quite time consuming. Are there bushfire controls on the site? And another interesting thing is under-counter policies. Now, these are policies that different councils might have that are not written anywhere, but it's just how individual councils process applications and some of the idiosyncrasies that each council have. So they all are different. They all come to it from a different perspective. Some councils allow side-by-side developments. Some councils will refuse one. They just don't want a bar of them. So that's important to know, but you won't find that written down anywhere. Other important things are the services. Are there services over your property that you need to be aware of that are not necessarily in an easement? Or are the services so far away that it might make the project financially unviable? So if you have to go 250 metres down to connect the stormwater drain, that might eat your whole profit up. That's all the things that you might look at even before you start looking at the site itself. You know, how big's the site? You know, the proportion of the block. You know, a long, skinny block might not be as good as a site that has a wider frontage, something that Golan referred to earlier. The orientation, where's north? You know, a property on one side of the street might be better than the other because you'll have nice sunny filled backyards on one side of the street, not on the other. Are there any trees? Not only on your property, there might be trees on neighbouring properties. There could be a tree that's 5 metres inside a neighbour's property that can influence the outcome of that site that you're looking at. Even neighbours' windows, neighbours' open spaces, and if we're going to protect any of their solar panels or that sort of thing. So there's some of the things that you might be looking at in a due diligence period, even before you can figure out what you can and can't do with the site and financial feasibilities and other things that come along with it. But just from an architecture and planning perspective, so there's some of the things. So in
terms of the timing, Pat, like how long would people need to have with working with someone like yourself to having that due diligence period? Like, let us say today I started looking at properties. Is it a couple of weeks that you need? Like, what sort of time frame should people work on?
Look, in an ideal world, a couple of weeks gets you a medium value assessment of the site. Sometimes you need to make a decision early. Sometimes, like you'll get an agent, like Golan, say to a client, look, we've got a site. You need to decide though by tomorrow. So you make an assessment as quickly as you can on the information that you have. But the longer time you have, the more due diligence you can do and the more thorough it will be. So there'll be less risk. You de-risk it. For example, if there's a flooding overlay on a property, my current advice to a client is, unless you can get a 2-month due diligence period, don't touch it. Melbourne Water can have a condition on it that makes it almost undevelopable. That's too high a risk if you're purchasing a property because it's not like a stock you can come in and out of. It's quite time-consuming and lengthy process to get in and out of something. You don't want to make a mistake like that. Because you can't make an assessment within 1 day or 2 weeks, my advice is, even though it might seem really a great deal, if you can't develop it and it doesn't suit your needs, it's not a good deal. Doesn't matter how cheap you buy it.
Because what you think so what it sounds like you're talking about is that there's certain issues in a site that if they're not determined early on, they're actually fatal to the profitability of the site. This goes back to whether you can make, because we're in development to make a profit ultimately, aren't we?
Absolutely.
And if these certain issues aren't known at the start, you might be buying into a site, and no matter how cheap the land is, the site is just never going to work from a profitability perspective because the cost of dealing with that particular issue is so prohibitive. So going back to sort of what Golan was talking about, then he was talking about paying, in certain circumstances, to pay a premium for a property, almost take it off the market, I guess. So I guess what we'd be talking about is somebody to be very conscious of a due diligence period, maybe paying that little bit extra to just get that, a four-week period where they can look at a property that's in the contract, they'll pay this particular price to have that certainty. Have you seen situations where people maybe bought these sites and then had to sort of, I don't know, hand them back or resell them? You might have some horror stories there.
No, absolutely. And it happens more often than you think. Extreme situations where there was a nice double site, lots of development around it. There was a flooding overlay that came in through the site. It was really an 8-unit development in an area. But going through the Melbourne Water would not allow any more development than replacing the 2 existing homes that existed on the property.
Okay.
So that's one extreme. And I've had other extremes which you think may not happen, but a chap's walked in thinking he's bought a great little industrial site to do 3 little warehouses on, but the whole site, unbeknownst to him, was an easement. So it was actually a leftover piece of land that all you can do is store materials on it. but unless he looked at it clearly and with the intent of what he wanted to do with the site, yeah, that was useless to him as well. So that's something to, yes, they can be fatal. They can be fatal. So I guess the next thing I'll jump to is the why, the slide that you had with the why. So you might before you start on this journey, even before you start looking at sites, I think it's really important to understand why you're developing. In other words, what's your intent? Is your intent to build dwellings and sell them all for a profit, realize a cash profit? Is it to build your own sort of set of townhouses to lease? So it's a rental yield that you're after. Or it could be that you might have 3 children and you want to leave them something that's of equal value to each of those kids. There could be other reasons, non-financial, there could be environmental, there could be social reasons. But it's important that you're clear in your mind why you're doing something. And the reason, so what's that got to do with architecture and planning? Well, that will assist in giving the brief to your architect or designer. So whatever your why is, the reason why you're doing this development will lead to a completely different outcome, okay, for an architectural planning outcome. For example, I get asked the question, what's the maximum yield I can get on a 1,000 square metre site? Well, I mean, there's potentially, off the top of your head, you could have 4 different outcomes. You know, on a 1,000 square metre site, you could do 2 nice side-by-side individual homes on that site. Equally, you could do 3 nice townhouses on that site. You could equally do 5 2-bedroom townhouses that might have a great yield, or you could do a small apartment building with a basement and get 10 on there. So 10 is obviously a greatest number, but that might be expensive to build. The 5 might be a great yield. So for every dollar you've spent, you're getting a lot more in return in terms of a rental return. But if you're after a cash profit, maybe option 1 or 2 is the best outcome. So there's no right or wrong answer. You need to help. You need to guide your designer and your architect. What's the reason? Why are you doing this development? So you'll get a better outcome if you're clear in your mind about what you're asking for. So that's that. From that perspective, I think that's pretty critical.
Right.
Yeah. So once you've purchased the site, you're ready to start the planning process. Now, some people might say, look, I've purchased a site. I'm not ready to build anything yet. I'm happy to, it's really actually for 3 or 4 years time or 5 years time when my kids are ready, or whatever the reasons are, you'd like to delay it. So the 3 things I'd like people to consider from that perspective is that, number 1, it takes a long time to get a planning permit. So starting the process when you have time up your sleeve and you're not rushing the process, I think that might lead to a better development outcome. It allows you to take the much time to make sure you've gotten the result that you're after. So that's 1. 2 is, once you've got a permit, you can sit on that permit for 2 to 4 years, and you don't have to act on it right away. Now, what have you done? You've added value to the site just in case you need to liquidate. You might think you're going to develop it in 5 years' time, but you have to liquidate for whatever reason in 2 years. If you have a permit on that site already, you've added some value. So you've increased what you can potentially sell that for. But the most important reason that I think people should act on a site once they've bought it is rules can change. What you can do with your site today may not be what you can do with it in a year, 2 years, 3 years' time. Rules do change. Sometimes they change overnight. So if rules change for the better for you, upgrade your permit. Just go back, get a better outcome. But if the rules change for the worse and that you can't achieve, they can't take away a permit that you've already got. As long as you don't let that lapse, they can't take that away. So you've got time to act on that permit. So that, from my perspective, rules can change overnight. So I'm conscious that people can sometimes get stuck. There was a few years back, a neighbourhood residential zone was instigated, any site that fell into that zone was only a dual lock site. So if someone thought they could do 3 or 4, they could only do 2. And I've had clients that sold their sites because of that, only to find that another year later, that rule was reversed.
Right.
So people lost, you know.
Imagine, Pat, too, when people buy a site and they think that I'm going to land bank this site, they and people lose track of, you know, we're all busy. The actual neighbourhood around them can change too. I mean, the neighbours could actually be doing things which could end up impinging on their site and meaning that yield is now reduced.
Absolutely. That's one of the constraints. If the rule, not only the rules, but if the environment around you changes, yeah, that can be, it sometimes can be a positive, but it can also be a negative.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a factor.
So yeah, we've got the process of, you know, collecting the data, briefs and designing, working with yourself, and then the planning application process. Yeah.
So look, it's the important thing to take away there is that the process, you should have as a comprehensive as an application as you can to lodge the council. That'll give you your best chance at council. So apart from the mandatory requirements are your architectural drawings, plans, elevations, etc. But you need to have a proper town planning report, the arborist report, which addresses any tree issues, a landscape plan, and the sustainability reports. But just keep in mind that there are lots of other consultants that may or may not be required for your site, depending on the site and its zoning, and depending on the design. For example, I've listed there a few. There was waste reports, traffic engineers, hydraulic engineers, you know, heritage consultants. They're all required, all take time and can be quite sort of time consuming. So you need to allow lots of time in your forecasting, otherwise you'll be frustrated. It's different to equities. You can't get in and out of these easily or quickly. It's a long-term process. I mean, from you deciding to buy a site to the time when you're ready to actually sell or lease, it could be a 24 to 36 month process. Yeah. So you need to allow that time, understand it, and then you can obviously do things to speed it up. There are a lot of things outside your control. There's council delays. There's a neighbours' objectives. The wait of VCAT at the moment is over 9 months. Just to get a hearing date at VCAT. So that's it can blow you out of the water from a time perspective. So you need to have those things in train. And that's just a quick, what you see on the screen is just a quick snapshot. Is once you've lodged an application, the process is there's the council they come back to you with an opportunity for either more information or clarification or list their concerns. It's the time when you've got to convince them of the merits of your application. Once you've
sometimes, Pat, sorry to interrupt, you would sometimes have a pre-application meeting, like at the start. Would you sometimes share some information about what you intend on doing and filling out the council?
Yeah, part of the concept phase, it's so that we skipped over this, but part of the concept phase is a part of getting the appropriate collection of data, the survey and the site services, etc., and the appropriate brief. Once you've got a design, get advice from your team. Speak to your agent. Does the design hit the demographic that you need to achieve? Speak to builders. You know, is this an appropriate design for the budget that you've set for yourself? What's the buildability like? Are you going for the wow that you need to spend a little money, or do you want to do something that's more conservative for a rental market? And thirdly is speak to council. Have a pre-app. Gauge the reaction from council before you head down the quite expensive process of an application. Get that feedback, and only then, once your team is satisfied that you've got a design with great merits and defendable, lodge the application. So 100%, you would lodge it first to see what they have to say. Yep. So and this process there's apart from negotiating with the council. It then gets advertised. Neighbours have an opportunity to object. But what I wanted to mention is they need to object on planning grounds. So they need to say, you must be overlooking or overshadowing something that relates to a planning. They can't have non-planning criteria, i.e. it's going to reduce the value of my property. It's not a planning concern. They might have that objection, but it's not something that the council can consider. And then obviously there's a decision. Council's then in a position to make a decision. Anyone can appeal that decision. Either the applicant can appeal any conditions, or if it's a refusal, equally objectors can appeal any approval that council gives. So it can elongate the process without sort of anyone's fault. So that gives you sort of a brief rundown, of the process. Yeah.
Great. We have a question. Is it possible to get a development on a very small block? For instance, we've got here a 380 square metre block, or is that too small to consider for development?
Again, you'd need to really delve in. So you could be in an inner city location that you could develop, in other words, more than one dwelling on a site that's 200 square meters. It just depends on its context. If the context around you is you've almost built on 100% of the site and you've got access to daylight, etc., and you're not impinging on other people's amenities, it may be possible. But if you're in a more suburban location with lots of trees around you and every other property is large, that may be a more difficult outcome.
Yeah, excellent. So very site specific.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Pat. That's been some great insights. We'll move along. So we've now had Golan help us find the property. We've had Pat help us to work through the design of the properties and the planning process. And now we're over to Brett to work out how we're going to find the money to do all this. So welcome, yes. Brett.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everyone. I am just being mindful of time. I'll be reasonably succinct. So if you'd like me to flesh anything out, Nick, please feel free to interrupt as I go. Now, financing these kinds of developments, you're falling into one of two buckets here. We either get residential terms, which are, as we'll go through and you'll see, quite favourable, or we're going to get commercial terms. So as I go through each point, I'll compare them based on those two factors. How we qualify for residential, look, this is your standard kind of building finance application. Anyone who's built a house and funded it through a big bank, that's the kind of transaction that we're talking about. Reasonably standard contract, nothing overly unique about it. 1, 2, or sometimes 3 dwellings. Any more than that, you're looking at commercial. And you have to be able to demonstrate that the debt is sustainable via your income. And that can include the return on what you're building. So you might say to the bank, I'm going to build 3, I'm going to keep them all and lease them out. In that case, we can email Golan, ask for a rental statement, a rental advice letter, and we can factor that income in. But it has to be sustainable. That's a very important point. If it isn't sustainable via income, that means obviously you need to sell one of the or maybe all of the dwellings when it's done to clear the debt. Or if it's more than 3 dwellings, that's when you're going to fall into commercial terms, which you can fund either through a big bank or a non-bank or a private lender. And I'll go through and compare each of those points. So the second one there, sorry, Nick, if you can just go back one for me, the LVR, residential terms, very standard, 80%. There's not going to be a whole lot that goes into it. They're going to get a valuation based on the build contract, your land value plus the build cost, the hard build cost of the contract. Generally, that's where you're going to land. I wouldn't expect it to be more. A lot of people will build and expect a price higher than that. The bank might very well say, yeah, you're probably right, but they're not going to give a valuation higher purely because the valuation is the measure of their risk. On the commercial side of things, I've put in there max 70, but I really wouldn't go into a project expecting 70%. I'd go in expecting 60. That's generally where the market is. You can do 70. You're really going to have to tick a lot of boxes for it. You're really going to have to make the bank happy. And you're also probably going to get charged for the pleasure. So yeah, I'd certainly expect more like 60% on commercial terms. Thank you, Nick. The interest rate, the big one, the interest rate and the finance costs. Residential terms, very favourable. The kind of interest rates that you see advertised, when you're sitting home and watching TV at night, they're the rates that you're looking at. Maybe a little bit of a premium on the absolute bottom of the market because you are going to be looking at interest only during the build term. If you were doing it today, I'd certainly expect 2.5% to 3%, maybe a touch over 3%. Quite favourable. Nothing really to worry about in terms of application fee either. A few $100. The valuation is going to be funded by the bank. Nothing overly onerous. Commercial terms, so through a big bank, the debt itself is not too expensive. I've put in there about 3%, with a maybe say 1/4 to 0.5% variance depending where you go. They'll also charge a facility fee as well though. A facility fee is an amount based on the loan limit, the funding limit, that you pay regardless of the funds that you've drawn. and that's going to be payable from approval. So you might say, I need $1 million, but I need it staggered over the 9 or 10 or 12 months of the build. They won't charge the interest rate until they actually fund the money, but they'll charge the facility fee up front. They'll also charge an application fee. I've put in there circa 1%. It's quite negotiable. From a non-bank or a private lender, the interest rate is more where they're going to generate a return for their funders. So 7.5 to 12%. There are many out there that would charge even more than that as well. Obviously, you wouldn't want to be looking at those though. They won't charge a facility fee. Instead, they're more building that into their upfront fee. And as you can see, they're 2 to 4%. So it's quite hefty as the actual upfront fee. The benefit there is a lot less work that goes into their actual approval. There's a lot less, I guess, that they would ask for in terms of the ins and outs of the development. So that's the main reason for the difference there. The benefit on the two commercial options through the big bank and the private lender is all of those costs will be fully capitalized into the debt amount, and that's factored into the LVR. So this is why I said expect to borrow 60% or maybe 61%, because these guys will cap their LVR at 65%, but they're going to build in capitalization of all of these costs. So the actual amount that you get is going to be net of that 61%.
So you won't be paying any out-of-pocket costs whilst you're developing. It's all added to the cost of the bank debt at the end.
Exactly right. Yep, they don't ask for servicing. They don't want to deal with it, particularly the private lenders. They don't want to speak to you every month for a transaction to get an interest payment from you. They're going to lend the money up front, and they're going to know, March next year, we expect a call with something on the market or something having been sold. On the residential terms, you are servicing it monthly, just on the interest amount as the dwelling goes up. So it's really not going to be a big servicing load until you kind of get more towards the end of the build.
Yeah.
Pre-sales in the residential terms as well, just not required. This transaction type is more based on long-term debt. So the banks are looking at this more like a 30-year loan, which is why they're not asking for that kind of thing. On the commercial side, it's the opposite. They're recognizing that this is a development. It's short term, maybe say 10, 12, 15 months, something like that. And so they're going to want that debt clearance. From the private lender, they won't ask for pre-sales. They're going to rely and they're going to trust on their valuation. So they're just going to know that, all right, well, we've got sufficient here. We know we're going to sell them straight away. If you don't, as the developer, they're not going to muck around. They need that debt. They need the money back so that they can give it back to their funders. Pre-sales via a big bank. The big banks will ask for sufficient pre-sales to clear the debt amount. Generally, the only exception to that would be if you, for whatever reason, wanted to maintain a debt level post-development. So if you said, I'm borrowing 2 mil, but I'm actually going to hang on to one of them, therefore I want to retain $1 million of debt for my own tax gearing. You just need to demonstrate that $1 million would be serviceable ongoing, and then you can bypass the need for the full amount of pre-sales. Thank you, Nick. Yep. Builder. So these residential terms are standard building contract. Cost plus, you can get away with cost plus sometimes. Generally, the banks won't specifically allow it in their policy, but if you go to the right place, you might be able to get away with that. But you really want the fixed price contract to be confident that you're going to get those terms. The commercial side of things, as you'll see there, it's a lot more onerous. They won't just be happy with the contract in and of itself, particularly for larger developments. They'll need to see that the builder's done projects at that scale, but also that design type before. An example that I ran into recently was underground basement car parks. If you had those as part of the design, you would be asked to demonstrate that the builder's actually completed those before, that they know what's involved. They've got a bit of experience there, just so the bank knows that things aren't going to blow out in terms of both time and cost during the course of the build. So again, a lot more onerous in commercial terms from that perspective. The last point that I've put there, the timing, it's so fluid, it's really hard to actually give a good indication there. But I generally say allow a month, even if you think something's going to take a week, just allow a month for it. The valuation, especially for a larger development, is really the main part of things at the start. And then teeing everything up after that doesn't take as long, but you just don't know which part of that's going to cause a delay. So I wouldn't be wanting to initiate anything like this on a time frame less than a month. It can be done, of course. Private lenders, particularly, they're really quick. Like I said, though, you just don't know which part of things might cause a delay. You want to be able to build that allowance in.
A couple of questions, Brett. We've got a member of the audience asking if they're self-employed, been in business for less than 12 months, so only a short period of time, what are the servicing requirements if they're considering property development? How would they be viewed by the bank from a servicing perspective?
Yep. So, I mean, look, in these commercial terms, you wouldn't even have to demonstrate your own personal income. So if the development is of a scale where the increased costs in that transaction type are fine, they can be absorbed and they can be covered by it, you wouldn't even need to worry about it at all. If you were aiming for residential terms, it's probably harder. It's doable, but it's harder, and you will be charged. So a lot of the interest rates and that kind of thing that I've put in there, you're not going to be getting those. You might have to more so be looking at low doc terms, interest rates closer to, say, 5 or 6%.
Is it fair to say that the large banks have a bit of an aversion towards development? They're probably not really so interested in it, and therefore when they do the deals, they're probably likely to look at the really great ones, low risk, great servicing, almost like it's not even really a development deal, is it really, if it's from the big bank?
Yeah, exactly right. And it even comes down to, it's not even so much bank policy, it comes down to just the individual that you're dealing with as well, whether they, if they've got 10 people to speak to this week, where are you on that list? If you're coming to them wanting to borrow 600,000 or 700,000, he's got another call, someone wanting to borrow 4 million. Well, it's going to be a lot harder for you to get your deal across the line, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a couple of other questions from the audience, somewhat finance related and interestingly, somewhat probably I guess, profitability related. Ash has asked, can we talk about the process of attempting to subdivide a block where there's a family home on it? And we often see this in Melbourne. It might be a 1,000 square metre block. It might be a little house at the front, nice big 400 to 500 square metre space at the back that we can maybe subdivide and put a home at the back. Is that something that you've seen over time, Brett? Is that something that's come up?
The subdivision aspect of it is fine. There's no real issue. I mean, the bank is worried about their security. So if you chop the block in half, the bank's going to want mortgage over both unless individually you can demonstrate that there's sufficient security to cover whatever debt's on there. Beyond that, it's fine. It's not a problem. It's really no different from having your main home and an investment property a suburb away, both supporting 1 or 2 or 3 loans. Yeah.
And certainly from a tax perspective, there are some concessions around what's called main residence exemption, which can be considered to mitigate any tax if it's ever sold at the end. Another question we have is around return on investment, and this is an interesting one, return on investment, because certainly if we're talking about the finance aspects of development, it's one that I'm very keen to understand when talking to clients as an accountant. So the question is around whether an existing house gets a better return on investment versus developing one. I know that, Brett, you obviously deal more on the finding of the money. And certainly from my perspective as an accountant, I do a bit of work in this area. It's a really good question. When we're looking at an existing house, an existing dwelling, it often has the benefit of already having a house on there that's of some intrinsic value to the end. So we're not having to construct a whole new dwelling. So we can maybe renovate that existing house with the view of saying, okay, we only put in a smaller amount of money and get a slightly smaller return. So the return on investment can be a particular amount, versus developing, which is a whole different calculation altogether because it requires large sums of money in, but large sums of money come out at the back end. So the best answer to that question from the attendee on return on investment is we love spreadsheets. We love using Microsoft Excel. We put all the numbers into a spreadsheet and we run scenarios. So one thing we haven't spoken about today is when you're doing your due diligence, we've spoken about buying a property, we've spoken about getting planning applications, spoken about bank funding, but you want to be using some really complex spreadsheets to do some due diligence to work out what would be the projected return on this particular project. That's a really important one as well. Don't think there's any other questions there. we've probably exhausted our time allocation for today. So thank you, Brett. Thank you, Pat, for your participation. Thank you, Golan, who unfortunately had to run off quickly. He did have another appointment. It's a very hot property market, so he had to run off to the next appointment. We're very thankful for all three of you for presenting today. It's been very helpful, and thank you to the audience for attending. We appreciate your time, and look forward to seeing you next time at the next presentation. Thanks, guys.